Looking back, I never would have imagined my life would come to this. If you'd asked me just a few months ago, I would have said David and I had the perfect marriage. He was the kind of husband most women only dreamed about. Dependable, thoughtful, and never one to let work overshadow his time with us. Even when the long hours piled up, he always made sure to be home in time for dinner, asking about my day, playing with the kids, making sure we felt loved. I fell in love with him when we were in our 20s. Back then, everything was simple. We were that annoyingly cute couple everyone talked about. He had this way of making everything seem easy, like no problem was too big for us to handle. We traveled, we laughed, we dreamed about our future together. He was always there for me. Always. And I never doubted that we were solid. Then something changed. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. He'd be distracted at dinner, lost in thought, his fork hovering midair like he'd forgotten he was even holding it. I'd asked him what was on his mind, and he'd smile that same reassuring smile, brushing it off with a quick, just work, nothing to worry about. But I started worrying anyway. He took more business trips than usual, each one more mysterious than the last. When I asked where he was going, he was vague, dodging the question like it didn't matter. And then there was a bite. I remember that day so clearly. He came home late from one of his trips, his arm bandaged, looking exhausted and different. It wasn't just physical, though. I noticed a change in his skin, how pale he looked. He shrugged it off when I asked, telling me it was just an animal bite. He was so casual about it, like it was no big deal, but the look in his eyes told a different story. There was something he wasn't telling me, something he was keeping hidden. For weeks after that, things spiraled. He became more distant, more absent. Even when he was physically there, it felt like he was miles away. I tried to ignore it first. Maybe it really was just stress. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But the more I tried to convince myself everything was fine, the more it felt like my world was unraveling. I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Was there someone else? Was he seeing another woman? It was such a foreign thought, David having an affair. But it was the only thing that made sense. What else could explain his behavior? The breaking point came one morning, not long after he'd returned from yet another business trip. I was taking the kids to school when I noticed something odd on the trunk of David's car. A sticky note, bright yellow, fluttering in the breeze. My heart sank as I read the message. Sorry I scratched your car last night. You should stop parking it on the street though. Neighbor from 283. Here's my number. A chill ran down my spine. We didn't have any neighbors with that number, and David had been gone. He hadn't even been home to park the car, so how could someone have scratched it? The note set off alarm bells in my head, but I pushed them aside. I needed to know more, so later that evening, after the kids were in bed, I called the number. My hand shook as I dialed, dread pooling in my stomach. When the woman picked up, I could feel the blood drain from my face. She sounded friendly, polite even, but what she told me made my heart race. She wasn't talking about some random street, and she definitely wasn't mistaken about the car. She described David's car down to the tiniest detail, the scratches, the dents, even the sticker on the rear window. She mentioned how she'd seen him coming and going from a house on her street, a house that wasn't ours. I hung up the phone, my mind reeling. The air felt thick, heavy, like I couldn't breathe. What was David doing? Why was he parking his car at another house? Was it her house? Was this woman the reason for all his secrets? My heart raced as 1,000 thoughts flooded my mind. I spent years trusting David, building a life with him, raising our kids, believing in the man he was. And now it felt like everything was crumbling. By the time he came home that night, I was a mess. Angry, hurt, scared. He walked in looking as exhausted as ever. But all I could think about was that note. That conversation. The questions I'd been avoiding for weeks all came rushing to the surface, demanding answers. I didn't waste any time. I confronted him right there in the kitchen, my voice trembling with emotion. "What's going on, David? Why have you been so distant? And where have you really been going?" He looked at me, confused, as if he had no idea what I was talking about. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "I talked to someone today. A neighbor. She saw you. Your car was at her house, David." "Why?" I could see the shock register on his face, but I didn't let him respond. "Don't lie to me. I need to know the truth. Are you seeing someone else?" The words were out there now, hanging in the air between us, and I braced myself for whatever came next.